I need to upload my slides.
Yes, yes, you have to upload them by this tiny files icon upright
Yeah.
of your screen.
Hmm.
So let's go to our first talk. Professor James McClelland received his PhD in cognitive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania in 1975. He served on the faculty of the University of California, San Diego, before moving to the Carnegie Mellon in 1984, where he became a university professor and held a Walter van Dyck Chair in Psychology and Cognitive Neuroscience. He was a founding co-director of the Center for the Neural Basis of Cognition, a joint project of Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh. And in 2006, McClelland moved to the Department of Psychology at Stanford University, where he founded the Center for Mind, Brain, and Computation in 2007. And he served as the department chair from fall 2009 through summer 2012, I think. He is currently the professor in social sciences and co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, Computation, and Technology. Professor McClelland has served as senior editor of Cognitive Science. He is a member of National Academy of Sciences and a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. He is now teaching at Stanford University and is a consulting research scientist at Google DeepMind. So if anyone has any question, you can raise your hand and presenter can turn your microphone on. We're on you, sir.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Today I'm here to tell you about human and machine learning, how each has taught us about the other, and what is left to learn. And so let me see here. Yeah. I'm going to talk about learning systems in the brain. And basically, I'm going to talk first about the idea that we have learning systems that work together but are very different complementary systems. And then I'm going to talk about how these learning systems, these kind of complementary learning systems ideas have been very influential in artificial neural network research. And then I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about aspects of human learning that we can't yet capture in artificial systems, and that we're working hard to figure out right now. So the starting place for my thinking about learning is, and knowledge and memory, is that everything is essentially in your connections. When you have an experience, like you look out at the world and you see an object, and maybe you hear somebody say the name of that object, this experience creates a pattern of activation over the neurons in your brain. So some of the neurons will be neurons that respond to the visual input, and others will be neurons that respond to the sound of the name of the object. And these different kinds of inputs will come together and influence neurons that are near each other, and those neurons will have connections to each other. And when those neurons are active together, they will tend to learn to activate each other. So after the experience is done, what's left behind? What is the memory? So the memory is the set of changes that happen to the strengths of the connections. each experience leaves some changes. And so when we think about, the memory trace, what is in my brain after I've had experience, it's the whole set of changes to all the connections among all the neurons. And, in a sitting like this in the diagram that you see here on this slide, each different kind of experience, each different experience you have with another object and another name will produce patterns of activation on the same neurons, and the same synapses will ultimately be involved, so that what you learn is actually not distinct or separable. It's sort of overlaid on top of what you've learned about other things. So your knowledge is sort of like somehow all superimposed and entangled together in all of the connections among the neurons. So what does it mean to remember something? Well, if I saw an object that I'd seen before and somebody had named it the first time I saw it, then the presentation of that object a second time would activate some of the same neurons, and the connections that got changed the first time I saw it would have inputs coming to them, and so they would tend to cause the name that I had heard, the pattern for the name, to be reactivated in my mind when I see the object. So recall involves the recreation of a pattern using a part of that pattern or an associate of that pattern as a cue. And this reinstatement depends on the knowledge that is in the connection weights, which in general will reflect influences of many different experiences. So a key thing to think about whenever you think about memory is the idea that memory is always a constructive process. It depends on contributions from many different experiences. Okay, I'm just going to check and make sure that you guys can hear me, and everything is going okay. And even if there's a question now, I'd be glad to hear it. But I don't want to keep talking for a whole hour and find out that nobody's hearing me. Okay, it's all going well. I'm going to see if I can activate my mouse pointer here. Yeah, so you guys can still see the slide, I hope. And can you now see my pointer on the slide?
Sir, I'm sorry for the interrupt. You should click on the button again, and then your cursor would appear.
Okay. Which button?
The button on up left of your slides window.
Okay.
Yes. And this is a cursor button.
Oh yeah, there it is. Yeah. You see it now?
Now we can see it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So next slide here. So now that we have this very basic sort of starting place for thinking about learning and memory, I want to tell you about a very, very striking pattern of deficits in memory that occurs when somebody has their hippocampus removed. So what you're looking at here is a picture of the brain. You're looking at it, from the bottom. So you could see the two halves of the brain on the left and the right. And what you're seeing is a part of the brain where on the left, it's been cut away, removing a patch of brain on both sides, actually. It's shown cut away on one side, but you want to think about this patient had both sides cut away. So it removes the entire, what's called the medial temporal lobe of the brain. This part of the brain is very much involved in epileptic seizures, and that's why this patient had it removed. But the effect of this was to completely eliminate this person's ability to learn new things from one or a small number of experiences. So the most dramatic instance of this, if you could come into his hospital room and talk to him, maybe for 5 or 10 minutes, you could carry on a conversation with the guy. If you went out of the room and came back 2 minutes later, he wouldn't recognize having seen you. He wouldn't remember a conversation with you. He wouldn't have no idea who you were or anything that you had said. And yet, his knowledge of the world, his memory for his own past growing up, his general intelligence, his ability to read and write, his ability to talk to you, all kinds of things that he learned would still be intact, right? So this part of the brain seems to be especially important for our ability to learn new things quickly, but isn't the part of the brain where the knowledge that we acquire gradually as we're exposed to our culture and our language and the skills that we're taught in school, it isn't the part of the brain where all of that knowledge is located. So it seems to play a very, very special role, right? Now, actually, I'm even more fascinated with the part of the brain that does all that other kind of learning, the kind of learning that builds up gradually over time. Do you see the pointer? I'm not actually pointing at anything right now, but somebody asked about that. Okay, so anyway, so what I'm most interested in is the kind of knowledge that isn't in this part of brain. It's the knowledge that we learn gradually over developmental time through our experience. So let's think about that a little bit. Well, sorry, before I get to that specifically, I just want to give you this overall picture. So based on the effect of this lesion, we could say when you have an experience, it produces activity, throughout the cortex of your brain. That's sort of shown here. And the experience activates neurons in all these areas, and those activities project activity into the medial temporal lobe, the part that was removed in this patient. And so when we learn something, some new thing rapidly, we're actually changing the connections within this part of the brain. But as we experience things over and over again, like we see our friends every day and we hear their names day after day after day, we gradually build up knowledge in the connections among the neurons in the cortex. And so we no longer need the hippocampus for that knowledge. But early on, after we first experienced something, when we see somebody we've just met before, it produces a pattern of activation in our cortex somewhere that has to probe the hippocampus, send activity in there, and then that pattern completion process I talked about takes place within the hippocampus and allows us to, let's say, retrieve the name of that person or something like that. Okay, so let's talk about the slow learning part of the brain, the part in the cortex, which I've represented here with all these arrows in blue and light green. So the key points about the way this system learns is that it learns about the general pattern of experience, not just the specific things. And it learns gradually, and it builds up implicit semantic knowledge about, the properties of objects and how they interact with each other, and procedural knowledge, such as how to read and write and talk and walk, ride bicycles and play musical instruments. And so the hippocampus complements this by allowing us to learn specific things without interference with existing knowledge. And in general, these systems must be thought of as working together rather than being alternative sources of information. Okay, so I'm going to now talk about this slow learning part. And the key thing here is we're going to think about how distributed representations or patterns of neural activity, what are called embeddings in machine learning, gradually emerge through this gradual learning process. And in earlier work, I wrote a whole book about this. We investigated all kinds of aspects of the way this gradual learning process would help us understand aspects of people's development of their conceptual knowledge. But I'm just going to focus on one aspect of that right now, which is how our knowledge becomes more differentiated as we have more and more experience. So this is just an indication of this differentiation process that I was mentioning. This slide actually presents a schematic depiction of results from an experiment where somebody asked children at different ages. So kindergarten, these kids are like six years old, maybe 5 or 6. Second grade, 7 or 8 years old. Fourth grade, 9 or 10 years old. And sixth grade, 12 years old or so. He said to them, okay, is it okay to say that a person or a man could be sorry? If the child says, yeah, that's okay, then we could put man underneath sorry. But you could also ask, well, is it okay to say that milk can be sorry? And the child, if the child says, no, milk can't be sorry, that's silly, then you won't put it under sorry. And so you can build up a tree like this by asking kids questions about what they think is okay or silly to say. And when kids are young, they tend to group things together much more so than when they're older. So this young child is grouping the man and the pig together, and you can see that all the things that humans can do, sort of pigs also are okay with doing. But when they get a little older, they realize that humans and animals aren't completely the same. Maybe they share some characteristics, but not all characteristics, and so their knowledge becomes more differentiated. And this is just data from 4 children, and but in general, their differentiation increases with age. So we can understand this process by thinking about knowledge in connections. So this is a diagram of a little neural network that learns about the properties of objects. And my colleague Dave Rumelhart, who actually invented the backpropagation learning algorithm, first introduced this little neural network. And he was basically just interested in the idea that our semantic knowledge, right, our knowledge of facts of the world and things, could be stored in connections in a neural network. So this is his little neural network that's going to store connections about, and it's going to learn things about these different kinds of objects and their properties. So the way this model works is that you present it, it's kind of like it learns propositions or facts about things. So for example, this figure here, I think, is going to show us another way of thinking about the facts that we know. So we know that, let's say, a bird can fly and a bird has wings, and we know that a robin is a bird. We know that a robin is a red bird, if you know robins, and a canary, maybe you know that it's a yellow bird, but you know that it's a bird and it can fly and it has feathers and it has wings. So this is one way of representing knowledge and facts about things. But what Rumelhart did is he said, I want my neural network to learn this knowledge. So I'm going to present on the input, robin can, and I'm going to ask it to tell me all the things that are true of robins in this tree. So a robin can fly, it can move and it can grow. So those are the things that it's going to learn about. And so to teach it this, he presents Robin with can on the input of his network, and he lets activation throw forward through this network until it comes to the output side where it produces some pattern of activation. Now at first, because the network doesn't know anything, it produces the same mushy sort of pattern across the output units for all different kinds of inputs. But the idea is that you get input telling you what a robin can do, and based on that input providing a teaching signal, you adjust the strengths of the connections a little bit, like I was describing at the beginning of the talk. And after each presentation, you make a small adjustment to these connections, okay? So this is it's not the fast learning that occurs in one trial, it's the slow learning process that occurs in your cortex, according to my way of thinking. And that means we expect it to build up slowly. So indeed, in a neural network of this type, if you train this kind of network, it won't learn things super fast. You could turn up the learning rate all you want, but it takes a while for it to learn. It takes a while for the connections to begin to get organized and find the right values and strengths. And we're gonna see what that process looks like. We're actually going to look at the patterns of activation on those neurons. So sorry, I should go back to the diagram. We're looking at these 8 neurons, and each of them has a connection weight from each of these input units. So the neuron from Robin projects to all 8 of these neurons, and so when we turn this on, it produces a pattern here, and that pattern is then going to be what drives the network's output in conjunction with the relation over here. Okay, so if we look at these patterns early on in learning, they're mushy and very similar to each other, right there. So the pattern for the robin, each unit has an activation between 0 and 1, and you could see they're all kind of in the middle here. But if we look again after 150 epochs of training, this means 150 times we've been through all the patterns, one pattern for each of the objects, and then for each of the 4 different kinds of relations. So Robin can, Robin is, Robin has for the parts of the Robin, and Robin is for the categories that Robin is involved in. And if we look at the outputs after 150 epochs, what you can see is that at this point, they've become much more differentiated. So the robin and the canary are quite similar to each other, but they're very different from the sunfish and the salmon at this point. And you can see that the animals are all very different from the plants. Now the plants, the rose and the daisy, are very, very similar. Indeed, the pine and the oak are very similar. They're all quite similar, right? But there's a little bit of a difference between the pine and the oak and the rose and the daisy. The network hasn't quite finished learning. After it learns even more, these become even more differentiated. But even at this point, we see something interesting, which I'll try to illustrate on the next slide. If we look at these 3 different times, what we can see is that early on, the patterns are very, very similar, and they're undifferentiated. And they're, if we group them in terms of which 2 are most similar, and then we group them again, they don't really go together in ways that make any meaningful sense. So the daisy is grouped with the sunfish, and the pine is grouped with the canary. This is because the network is initialized with small efforts, and it's separated the plants from the animals, and it's separated the birds from the fish, and then within each of those subclasses, it's beginning to learn to separate the items from each other. So the cool point here is that this network is undergoing a progressive differentiation process, and what we see in the intermediate time point is that really at this point, it's only separated the plants from the animals. It hasn't yet really differentiated within the animals or within the plants very well. So this gradual differentiation process that's occurring in this neural network recapitulates that gradual developmental process that we saw in the data from those kids from the kindergarten through the 6th grade. Okay, so maybe I should pause here. Oh, there is a question. So somebody said, why should the link weights converge to the on and off patterns, and why do they produce this specific pattern? Okay, so I didn't really discuss that much, but let me say something about that. I have to go back to this slide. So this network is being trained with the backpropagation learning algorithm. Maybe somebody could tell me how much you guys know about backpropagation. Has anybody heard of backpropagation? Yes, yes, I know. Yes, yes. Yes, sir. Yep. Okay. So everybody's heard about it. All right. So I'll just remind you briefly then, okay? So what backpropagation does is it takes the pattern of activation that's produced when we go forward through the network and compares that to the target pattern that the environment is telling us we ought to be producing on the output. So in this case, the target pattern is essentially telling the network that all these units should be off. All these units should be off, and only these 3 here should be on. So those are the targets for the backpropagation learning process. And so initially, right, when the weights are all tiny and random values, any of these inputs, you could pair, let's say, Robin with Ken or Pine with Isa. Any of those is just going to produce the same sort of mushy stuff across the output. And when you say, oh, for Pine Isa, you're supposed to say living thing, plant, tree, then you get the teaching signal, and you use the backpropagation algorithm to make little adjustments to the strengths of all of these connections. Okay, so these adjustments tend to occur very slowly at first, and the reason is that the error signals that are coming from the output units back to the hidden layer are being propagated backwards through the connection weights here. And when these connection weights are small and random, the error signal that gets propagated back is very weak. So there's not much teaching signal to tell these weights how to change. And there's even less teaching signal to tell these weights how to change. At the same time, because the weights going forward are small and weak, there's actually not very much for the learning from the hidden layer to the output layer to work with. All the patterns are the same, and so it's going to make these conflicting adjustments to all these weights each time, and they're just going to kind of cancel out. So that's why it takes the network a long time to learn. And it builds up slowly. As the weights build up, they actually, learning can then occur much more quickly. So somebody now asks, are the connections in the brain sparse or dense? So according to me, they're pretty dense in the cortex. That doesn't mean that every neuron in the whole cortex is connected to every other one, but it does mean that within a region of the cortex, the neurons are fairly densely interconnected, and when they get an input from another modality, it's going to produce a pattern of activation that's going to activate many of, not quite as many as in this particular model, but let's say 15-20% would be activated at a given time by a given concept. Whereas deep inside the hippocampus, they're very sparse. So somebody else asked a question. I have a question. You just digitize features in diagrams, but we can also learn with more non-digital analog approach, such as infinite numbers, which are not finite state systems. Is there any way to learn things in non-finite systems? Okay, so the choice to use discrete ones and zeros in this network is a somewhat arbitrary choice. There's no reason why they have to be ones and zeros. You could learn, non-binary patterns, continuous valued patterns. That's okay. The internal patterns are non-binary, as you saw already, right? They're continuous valued. And the network is like learning connections that map from non-continuous patterns here to non-continuous patterns here. And then, we're forcing it to discretize at the output, but we're doing that because we're putting it through kind of a squashing function. In fact, a neural network is intrinsically a continuous, not a discrete system. So when Rumelhart was doing this, he was saying, oh, look, you can even learn things that we think of as discrete facts, like a robin can fly, and, a canary can sing, right? These are things that we might think of as binary true or false. Of course, if you ask a question, can a turkey fly? Then the answer is, well, sort of, right? So in fact, things aren't always all or none. And if you ask people to answer questions like, how much would you say that a hippopotamus is a water animal? You get an answer that's intermediate between the answer you get for how much would you say a whale is a water animal and how much you would say a cat is a water animal. So these things are more continuous in our minds, and this is just an approximation. I don't see why we can't include feelings in this. What's wrong with that? I have no idea why we couldn't have feelings. Okay, somebody else asked, in your example, we almost know the structure of neurons, so we could build our neural net based on the architecture. But what do we usually do when we don't know the structure? Well, so the art that Rumelhart practiced was the art of designing things to illustrate the points that he wanted to make. And this network illustrates that. When we think about the brain, of course, evolution shaped the brain. And so we would be asking a question about, well, why did evolution produce the particular structures in the brain that it did? When we're designing artificial systems, deep learning research is largely about the question of what architectures and what additional details should we build into our systems. This is an extremely generic little neural network, but I hope you take away from this that these properties, the slow learning aspect of a deep learning system, which this is an early example of a deep learning system, right? It's got multiple layers of connection weights that are trained with a backprop style learning algorithm, just like a convolutional neural network with you know, 168 layers of connections, right? It's really the same algorithm. And the same principles apply, that those very deep networks also learn slowly. And they're trained with many exposures to patterns, right? Or many patterns are used to train them. And you know, the other thing is they only have general knowledge. They don't recognize specific items any better than they recognize items that they've never seen before. They've actually learned the general rules of how to project, you know, types of objects onto specific, or almost as well, for the items they haven't seen as the items they have seen. So the properties of this network are really actually extremely general ones. And in fact, if anybody's interested, I have a paper with Ganguly, a guy named Andrew Sachs and Surya Ganguly, in which we worked out mathematically the dynamics of learning in deep neural networks. And that appeared in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences last year. I'm never going to get to the end of my talk if I keep answering these interesting questions you guys are asking me. So maybe I should go on a little bit and tell you about what happens in a system like this when we try to learn something new. So let's go back to where I was before. Yeah, so what happens if we try to learn something new? And so we're going to think about a penguin. Now, what's interesting about the penguin is that it's not really like anything else that the model already knows. In some ways, it's like other animals, but it's like a fish, right? Because it doesn't fly, it swims, and it's like a bird because, well, we call it a bird, and it's kind of like got feathers and things like that, and it lays eggs like birds do and things like that. So the penguin is, right, an interesting special case relative to most kinds of animals that we know something about. So this is going to be where these complementary learning systems come in. And to illustrate why I think they're so important, I'm going to sort of consider what would happen if we trained this network, the one we've already seen, after it's learned what we've already seen, you know, it learned to differentiate these things, and it learned to produce the correct answers for each of these questions that we could ask it. It takes, you know, a bit more training than I showed you in those earlier figures to get to the point where the answers are pretty strongly activated and quite clear. So I think I ran it for like 500 epochs to get it to that point. So after 500 epochs of training, we're going to train this network with the penguin. We're going to teach it two things about the penguin. First, we're going to teach it that the penguin is so we're going to activate this new input unit for the penguin. And this is a unit, and the network is supposed to activate living thing, animal, bird, okay? And then that's one pattern. And then the other one we're going to give it is penguin can, and now it's supposed to activate grow, move, and swim. Okay, so this is actually not fully consistent with what it already knows, because everything that it already knows about that's called a bird can fly, and everything that it already knows about that can swim is called a fish, right? So this is inconsistent with that. So if we teach this neural network this new inconsistent information by just presenting these two patterns, right? We're just going to alternate the two and update the weights a little bit after each pattern. Then what we find is that the network learns about the new pattern quite quickly. You know, after only 5 patterns, it's mostly gotten rid of all of the error in its output, and it's quite close to the correct answer after about 15. And I could even turn up the learning rate and it would learn this very quickly, much more quickly than this. But the problem is that if I did that, it would interfere with what it already knows about the other animals. So after just training it with the penguin, it's going to think that all the animals can swim, and it's going to call them all birds. And that means it's going to be making mistakes with the fish by calling them birds instead of fish, and it's going to be making mistakes with the birds by saying they can swim and not fly. So that's what this is. This is the interference with the existing memories. And so if you try to learn new things quickly in a slow learning system, you actually will interfere with a lot of the other things that you know. And that is in part because of the fact that they're using overlapping connections. And so what you learn about one thing is going to be shared with what you learn about other things, and it's going to produce this interference effect. So the first person who discovered this phenomenon called it catastrophic interference, because in their experiment, it actually erased everything the network seemed to know before it started learning anything new. So that's what happens in these systems. But luckily, that's not what we do when we learn new things, right? When we learn new things, our cortical system does not learn them. Our hippocampus does. And we know that from the patient that I described to you before. If you tell him something new, he doesn't really learn it very fast. He did learn gradually over over the period of years that John F. Kennedy had been the president of the United States, right? This was something that was extremely important. It's like, how many times a day do I hear that Donald Trump is the president of the United States? Every day, over and over again, right? I cannot avoid this information. It's constantly barraging my brain. And so the cortex, the patient's cortex eventually learned about who the president was. But it was very slowly. He lost a favorite relative, a person who he spent time with every day. She died. And, a certain time in the afternoon came along and he knew that she would be there because he learned that gradually over time. And then he would ask, where's I don't remember her name. And his mother would have to tell him she's dead. And he'd like, what? She died? Only after months of this did he gradually stop asking. Okay, so his cortex didn't learn new things quickly. But but it did eventually learn things that it was exposed to repeatedly, right? So the way I think about this is that when we learn something new, it's our hippocampus that really learns it. And then gradually over time, if it's repeated frequently, or we think about it offline repeatedly, then we give our cortex training opportunities and the cortex gradually learns. And usually this means that the new experiences will be interleaved with ongoing experiences with other things. So if a penguin came into your life and you were amnesic, you wouldn't know much about it at first, but you'd gradually learn about it over time, and it wouldn't really interfere with what you already knew about other things because you'd keep seeing the other things in your experience. Okay, so I did a further simulation. Whoops. Yeah, so I was just describing this basically, this idea about how the hippocampus plays its role. So, the hippocampus sits here looking at all these different parts of the brain that represent all these different kinds of information about objects. And when we have a pattern, an experience produces a pattern over all of these different parts of the brain. And, very small adjustments to the connections among those parts of the brain occur with each experience. But if you have an intact hippocampus, you can learn new things quickly because the projections into the hippocampus will allow the fast learning system in the hippocampus to learn it. Okay. So this slide shows you what happened when I interleaved the experience with the penguin with ongoing experience with all the other animals. Okay, so in this case, it actually really slowed down the learning of the penguin, but it preserved all that other information. There wasn't really any interference with what the system already knew. Okay, so that is a little bit about these complementary learning systems in the brain. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the hippocampus avoids interference. So the hippocampus learns new things quickly, right? And we already saw that in the cortex, if you learn some new thing quickly, it produces a lot of interference. Well, how do we avoid that in the hippocampus? Well, the idea is that, as I already alluded to, the hippocampus uses very sparse coding. So this is a recording from a single neuron inside a part of the hippocampus called CA3, while a rat is running in a 8-arm maze. So he can run out and back in, and then out another arm and back in, and out another arm. And the rat runs around through the whole thing because the experimenter puts little bits of food out at the ends of all these arms. So the rat runs through the whole thing, and you get to see where in the environment the neuron fires. And this neuron that they're recording from, basically it only fired when the rat was running out on one of these arms, and only in the middle of that arm, right? And hardly fired at all anywhere else. Little tiny bits of firing in a few other places, but this is where so this is called a hippocampal place field. And, this neuron is responding only very small percentage of the time. But a neuron in a neighboring part of the cortex is responding like this, right? This neuron is responding basically all over the place. It responds a bit more when the animal's going out than when he's going in, and it responds a bit more in these arms than it does in these arms. But it's obviously participating in a population code with overlap with many, many other neurons. Okay, so we have denser coding in the cortex and very sparse coding in the hippocampus, and that helps to reduce interference. And maybe this next slide will help me explain why. So if you take a dense pattern and you make it sparser, and here how we're doing this is we're using something called conjunctive coding, so that each of the neurons in the sparse code only responds when a specific combination of neurons on the input is active. So this one responds when these two are active, and this one responds when these two are active, and this one responds when these two are active. And then, so that's the idea. All of these neurons respond when particular pairs of inputs are active, right? So what this means is, if we take these two patterns that have a lot of overlap, so they have 2/3 of their neurons in common, and we put them through this conjunctive coding, after the conjunctive coding, they only have 1 out of 3 neurons in common. And if you make it higher order, like triples of features all have to be present for a neuron to come on, or quadruples or something like that, it makes it even less overlapping, right? So this is the sort of the pattern separation effect that is attributed to the hippocampus. And the idea is that it takes inputs that overlap a lot and produce much sparser outputs. And in fact, this curve in the dentate gyrus is thought to be very extreme. So the input has to be overlap has to be very high before the output overlap starts to really get very, very strong. So once you've got the neurons active, 2 different experiences activating 2 completely different sets of neurons, then the connections will overlap less, and you'll have much less interference. So that's the basic idea. All right, so let's see where we are here in my talk. Yeah, so I've told you about these complementary learning systems, right? And hopefully you've got the idea that I think that they use different coding schemes. So one uses a very dense code, and one uses a very sparse code. One learns quickly, one learns slowly. One extracts the general structure of things gradually over experience, and the other learns new things quickly in ways that minimize interference. But I told you this talk was going to be about what the brain teaches us about artificial intelligence. And so now we're going to talk about that a little bit. And so I'm going to talk about two examples of models in contemporary deep learning systems that rely on ideas like this complementary learning system idea that I've described. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about something called the DQN. Any of you heard about DQNs before? Yeah, everybody's heard about DQNs. Good. Okay, so let's just have a brief review. A deep Q learning network is a deep learning system, very much like the one we've talked about so far. This is actually a paper from the DeepMind paper, a figure from the DeepMind paper about this. So this is supposed to represent a bitmap that's input to the DQN. And there's several convolutional layers. And then there's several fully connected layers of neurons. And then at the output layer, each neuron projects to essentially a neuron for each of the different actions that you could take if you were playing an Atari game. So this is a joystick with a button on the top. You could do nothing. That's one of the possible actions. You could move it in 8 different directions without pressing the button. That's another 8, so that makes 9. You could press the button, that's 10, and you could hold the button down while you move it in one of the 8 directions. That's another 8. A total of 18 different actions you can take with this joystick, right? So when each pattern is presented, this neural network is essentially learning to say which of these actions is the one that I should make to get the biggest reward. We're not going to go through the details of how it figures out how to get the biggest reward, but that's what it's got to learn, right? It's got to learn to map from bit patterns on the input to reward predictions on the output. And these are discrete actions, just like we were talking about before, right? It has to choose one discrete action in this world. People do train reinforcement learning systems to make continuous actions as well, but this is the discrete case. Okay, so this is a deep learning system just like the other one, and it learns really slowly. Part of the reason is that it takes it a while to kind of figure out which actions actually lead to reward, because the reward doesn't always come instantaneously. It comes after a delay. And that's part of what makes reinforcement learning even slower than regular old backpropagation style supervised learning. But even if we supervised this, it would be a slow learning system. Now, the thing is, what I want to tell you about this is that in order to get this thing to work, they relied extremely heavily on essentially a complementary learning system. So what they did was every time the network experienced an input, took an action, they stored in a buffer the input, the action, the next input, and the reward that the network got after it took the action. Okay, so state, action, next state, reward. These tuples are stored in a rehearsal buffer. and they store 1 million of them in a rehearsal buffer. Once they get to 1 million, they start throwing out old ones and replacing it with new ones. But every time they take a single new action in the environment, they sample a batch, like 32 or 64 or something, of these tuples from their rehearsal buffer, and they train the network with fully interleaved learning over all these items in this rehearsal buffer, sampling them randomly so as to get the network to learn. If they just train it as it plays a game and it just adjusts the weights after each new action, there'll be too much sort of correlation between the learning signals on related trials. It's like teaching it about the penguin all at once, and it never sort of settles down towards a good answer. So you have to do interleaved learning to get this thing to learn, and they got it to work by using a rehearsal buffer, right? So that's really a very interesting kind of instance in which a similar system that we use for human learning is also being used to make a deep learning system actually work. So they're really complementary in this case. Okay, so next I'm going to talk a little bit about the differentiable neural computer. And so the differentiable neural computer is also a lot like a complementary learning system. This is a figure from the differentiable neural computer paper. Have you guys heard about that too? No. Okay, people haven't heard about this. Okay, this is a really interesting model, and so this is your chance to learn a little bit about it. So this is a model. Let's see, maybe I'll show you the next slide first. This is a model that's going to learn how to do something really very impressive, I think. Okay, so this is what they did. This is one of the things that they taught it to do. So you can see over here, this is a set of 6 little numbered tiles that are provided to the network as an input. And so this input is present throughout a long episode, okay? Then while this input is present, they're going to present the network with several sets of goals that the network has to try to achieve. Okay, so one of the sets of goals is shown down here. So the network is, if the network is asked to act to move the little squares around to achieve these goals, then what it's got to do is get the thing to the point where the 2 is above the 6 and the 1 is to the right of the 4 and the 4 is above the 5 and the 6 is to the right of the 3. 1 is above the 2 and the 2 is to the right of the 5. Okay, so we can see, did it solve it? Yeah, it did, right? The 2 is above the 6 and the 4 is the 1 is to the right of the 4 and the 4 is above the 5 and so on, right? So it actually did solve this problem. So here's what happened. It presented it with, I think, 5 different sets of these goal constraints, maybe just 4. Yeah, okay, 4. So there's a set G that's only got 2 constraints in it, and then there's this set that has 6 constraints in it. These are presented one after the other. And then there's this set C that has 4 constraints, and then a set A that has 3, and then it gets a query, okay, solve it for the T constraints. And at that point, it's got to use the information that it's stored in memory about all this stuff and solve the problem. Okay, so that's the task. So how did it do that? Well, it has a neural network, which I think of as very much like my neocortical system here, which learns to take inputs and it maps them through a neural network and it produces outputs. And it has recurrent connections back into itself so that it can use its previous state to influence its next state. Okay, so far so good. But in addition to all of that, it has this, what they call a differentiable read-write memory. It's like a computer memory. It's got slots in it, right? So it's got, you're seeing a bunch of slots, n slots here, and each slot can contain a vector or an embedding, a pattern of activation, a learned pattern of activation, right? Nobody's specifying any of the features of these patterns. And what the network has to do is learn what to write to the memory and where to write it to the memory. And it's got this write head that has information that is used to specify where to write, and it also has information that's used to specify how much of what's already there to erase and what new stuff to put in to the places where things have been erased. So, and then it's got these read heads that, take a query. So the query is, I want something that has a +1 here, a -1 there, plus something there. Find me a pattern like that and bring back the rest of it. Okay, so this pattern here is a good match to that. So that basically gets read. And same way with the other read head, it's looking for a slightly more fully specified pattern, but it's going to fill in some missing bits in that. And so it reads back this information over here. So the key thing about this is that it learns all of this. It learns what to write, where to write it, what to look for in the memory, and when to look for it, and where to look for it. So let's go back and see how it did. When it was writing these T constraints into the memory, you can see that it actually wrote into the same set of cells repeatedly. And at this point, so it's writing into 4 memory locations. And by the time it's done, it's like repeatedly written into this first one and repeatedly written into the second one. I guess it's not using this third one too much. And then it's also writing into this one a couple of times, right? So it's not just writing these things once, it's updating what is written in the memory. But interestingly, it's not just literally writing the constraints. What they argue in the paper it's doing is that it's writing a kind of a plan for executing the sequence of steps. And the reason they believe that is because they can look at these patterns and decode from them what the first step is going to be with high accuracy, and even what subsequent steps are going to be with decreasing accuracy. Okay. And they're doing this by saying, okay, what memory locations is the network saying it's reading from? And if I take that composite vector that I get from that set of read locations, can I classify that and tell me what the network is going to actually do next? So, that's a complicated process in and of itself. But this network learned this stuff. So it learned actually very slowly over millions and millions of training examples how to store information in memory and read it back out again so that it could learn it from one presentation and not only just learn the information, but learn it in such a way that it would know exactly what to do to solve the problem. Okay. So this is a really incredible example of complementary learning systems that, you know, are represented by this neural network. So we could think of this part of the neural network as learning connection weights. And among the things that these connection weights learn is how to encode patterns that it wants to store, right? What patterns they should be, what they should be like, and how to encode queries that are going to ask for information that's already stored in that memory. And then also what information to actually write into the memory, and where to write it, you know. So that's a very complicated set of things that this network has been able to learn how to do, so that it's using its its hippocampus-like memory in a way that's really sophisticated. So this is where I feel like I'm learning something back from deep learning about how I should think about the hippocampus, right? Thinking about this paper, I get to ask myself, gee, do we as humans learn how to encode patterns so that we'll stick the right thing in our memory, as opposed to, oh, we just take whatever's there in the cortex and we sort of stuff that in the hippocampus? So that's the sort of the two-way street that I was referencing in my title. All right, so I'm pretty near the end of what I wanted to say. I want to say that there are two kinds of things that humans can do that current artificial neural networks don't do very well. And one of them is one-shot learning. So actually, there's a little bit of a subtlety to this. You could take a DQN, a differentiable neural computer, the system we were just describing, and you could teach it how to do this task pretty well. You could teach it how to learn to take an item and store it in memory and compare it to a bunch of other items and say which one it matches. That's what this task is. I show you this. You have to tell me which one of these things is the same. And you could do that, right? You could look at these things and, I don't know, maybe these are even letters in a Farsi script. Are they letters in Farsi? I don't know. But assuming they're not, you know, they'll be new to you just like it is to me. Indian. Somebody thinks they're Indian. Okay. They are from some script in some language somewhere. And you can look around and see when you find one that matches, right? So this is the one that matches, and it's easy to tell that if you look at sequentially. You say, oh yeah, that's the one that's pretty much the same. It's hard for people to learn. Sorry, it's hard for neural networks to learn a general system that will do this task in a way that matches people's ability to do it. So we've learned something about how we draw characters with a pen from our limited exposure to a few alphabets that allows us to do this in a way that generalizes to loads of alphabets we've never seen before. And when you try to train neural networks to do this, you have to kind of train them with almost all the alphabets, or actually some examples from all the alphabets, before they learn how to encode things well enough so that they'll be able to do a few held out examples. So it's really not so much one-shot learning per se that's at stake here. It's a little bit more sophisticated at a point. But the other thing is acquiring and adapting like new skills quickly from observation and instruction. So, you know, that DQN that I told you about, or sorry, the differentiable neural computer that learned how to move those tiles around. After it was trained to do that, well, that was the only thing that it could do, and it learned how to do that over billions and billions and billions of trials of practice, right? You would probably not need as much practice as that. So there's some ways in which we're able to build on our prior knowledge in ways that existing artificial neural networks can't. And this is one of the big challenges that I myself am currently thinking more about. Okay, so let's see. So how can we address these challenges? I think this may be my last slide. So one way to think about it is that we should give them what people call inductive biases that human learners bring to the task. And that's important. So one inductive bias for, like, let's say that character thing is that most of the neural networks that people have used are just visual pattern recognition things. They look at bitmaps of characters and they try to compare at bitmap level. But if you had to use a pen to produce characters, when you looked at the character, you might build up a representation of the strokes that you would make, and the set of strokes that you would make, although they wouldn't be identical on the page, would be similar strokes. They'd have the same number of like loops and the same kind of curls in them and so on. And so if you had that same kind of inductive bias, then maybe that would help you learn in a way that's more human-like. Another approach is to embed neural networks that learn specific tasks in larger systems that perform many tasks. So this is something that many people are actually pursuing. Like, if you learned how to play 40 different Atari games in the same neural network, maybe you'd learn the next one more quickly, right? But that's not the way people usually do it. They start with a brand new, fresh network and train it from scratch. And so that takes a long time because of kind of some of the things we've already talked about. It's got to build up knowledge about how to even recognize patterns in the pixels at all before it can learn what sensible things to do with those patterns. So I think both of these things are important, but I think there's something else. And that is that we can't talk to our neural networks. We can't say to them, oh, you know, this is the thing that you need to do to solve this problem. We can't give them instructions and have them understand it and then get them to sort of practice following the instructions so that they gradually can build up implicit knowledge that kind of captures the skill intuitively, right? So we learn how to walk without anybody telling us anything about how to walk. But when we learn how to drive a car, we get a lot of verbal instructions that are helpful in getting us started. And eventually our motor systems take over and it becomes wired into our connections. But initially we have this way of translating from explicit instructions into controls that we can put that then gradually let the system get started getting practice and getting off the ground. So these are some of the things that I think we need to do to get our neural networks to address these challenges. Do I have any more slides? Okay, my summary. Brains and artificial neural networks have a lot in common. We can learn about each from the other. Humans still have many advantages over machines. Building machines that capture the advantages humans still have is an exciting opportunity for the future. Okay, so I've probably gone over here, but I see there's one more question, and there's a big long question, but let me take this slightly shorter one first. So Mohammed asks, isn't this one-shot learning because we have some information about this kind of tasks that our competent machine has not? Yeah, that's kind of like what I was trying to say, right? So if we have learned a lot of tasks related to this previously, and we've learned to do them with the same tool, like using a pen, then we'll have prior knowledge that's relevant to this particular process. What would I do if I were producing that character? And that prior knowledge doesn't have to be sort of innately pre-specified. It can be something that comes from prior experience. I have to tell you that I've tried to get this to work, and I haven't so far succeeded in equaling the human performance with this. But yeah, I kind of agree with that point. So the other question here, Sir Traviola. So the question is, the brain can produce some pictures without any information about it, but always in neural networks we use some kind of information. Can we do it by a neural network? Let me read the rest of this. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure I follow all aspects of that question, but it relates to a piece of work that part of what I took out of Traviola's question here relates to a piece of work that one of my PhD students has just put up on arXiv. So it's a paper by Lampinen and McClelland. I guess I could type that. Lampinen and McClelland. And it's on arXiv. You should be able to find it very easily. And it's about a neural network. It's about how we could learn to form patterns of activation that we could then use as input to a neural network that sets the connection weights in another neural network. So this network essentially learns how to program other neural networks to do tasks. And then we have a pattern, which is just another embedding vector that represents the task. And so in this model, we can imagine that we can think of tasks as patterns, and then they become inputs to neural networks just like any other patterns, and then we can transform tasks by taking one task representation as an input and producing a new task representation as an output. So I think that relates to your question, and I'm not sure it covers all aspects of it, but it's a very, I consider this to be a very brilliant insight by my student, and I definitely suggest anybody who's interested in, sort of metacognition or self-programming, or how we guide a neural network with other activity inside the same network, to take a look at it. Yes, you can send me email to McClelland@stanford.edu if you like. Sure. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have a question? You can raise your hand by the hand icon.
I got another question in the chat here. Oh, this guy is just telling me it was great. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your wonderful feedback there. I appreciate the comment.
So there is no other questions, sir. It was a really pleasure for us and an honor for us I hope we can see you here in Tehran in our future seminars, if you accept our invitations.
Okay, I'll consider it. Thanks a lot, and I enjoyed your questions.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So next talk.